Sodium chloride, the chemical component of table salt, is a stimulus that elicits a salty taste on the tongue. It gives you a stronger appetite when you consume it, thus often leaves you hungry shortly after eating. Sodium is essential for human function. It facilitates the movement of fluids throughout the body, plays a vital role in signal transduction through the nerves, allows you to taste and to smell, and has a role in the contraction of all of your muscles. The problem with sodium chloride consumption now is that the majority of it comes from processed foods, contributing up to 80% of our daily salt intake. Over time, this has led to excessive consumption of salt. This has adverse health effects, including, but not limited to, increased risk of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, stroke, gastric cancer, decreased bone density, and obesity. Some evidence suggests that there is a link between decreasing salt intake to 1600 mg per day, leading to increased salt intensity when eating, and decreased liking of salty foods. The objectives for this paper are 1. To determine if salt taste sensitivity, perceived salt intensity, liking of varying salty foods is linked, and 2. If manipulating sodium concentration in hash browns influences the quantity intake of that food.
2 studies were included in this research, which were conducted at Deakin University. In Study 1, the total number of panelists were 56, which include 48 females and 8 males. 22 panelists took part in Study 2, 15 of them are females and the rest of them are males. All the participants in Study 1 were students enrolled in a sensory science course. The participants in Study 2 were recruited from Deakin University via email communication or response to advertising placed around the university. Then all the panelists' heights were measured in centimeters and the weight were measured in kilograms. Study 1. 1 hour period to sensory test. Participants were required no eating, drinking, and chewing gum. In Session 1, a series of 8 sodium chloride solutions were prepared in order to determine detection and recognition threshold of sodium chloride. Solutions were served in ascending concentration without letting the participant know the serving order. Participants were required to wear nose clips throughout the sensory testing, and room temperature water were provided for oral resin between samples. Participants had to choose and record whether there was absence of taste, a taste identified but unrecognizable, or a taste quality that was recognized. Session 2 took place in 2 weeks after the Session 1. Potatoes were diced and added different quantity of salt during production in order to ensure sodium distribution throughout the hash brown. 4 variations of hash brown were produced and were identical apart from the concentration of sodium. 4 variations of hash browns were served in a random order. Participants first rate the liking of each variation on a 9-point hedonic scale, which ranged from 1 to 9, and then rate the perceived intensity of saltiness on a structure of 10 cm line scale, with anchored at each end with not salty at all to very salty. Study 2. Decide no eating, drinking, and chewing gum for 1 hour period to their allocated session. The participant also required to complete a morning food record. Food record including quantity, brand, time the meal was eaten, how the food was prepared, and the cooking method. The Session 1 was exactly the same as Study 1's. Session 2, 3, 4, and 5 took place in 4 lunch times at the same time of days. Each lunch consists of 1 hash brown variety, salad, tea, coffee, and water. At the conclusion of each lunch, participants were asked to rate their liking of the lunch on a 9-point hedonic scale that ranged from 1 to 9. Statistical analysis. Statistical analysis was performed on SPSS. Values presented are mean plus minus SEM. ANOVA and Tukey HSD comparison were used to assess if there were significant differences in liking and perceived saltness intensity between the 4 variations of hash brown samples, and to determine if there was a significant differences in intake and the liking of hash brown.
Hello, this is Ina. Here we come to the result and discussion part. Based on the previous study, this study estimated the oral sensitivity to salt taste is not a factor in liking salty food. When the sodium concentration of hash brown is decreased, not only the intensity of salt taste decreased obviously, but also the liking is influenced at the same time. The lunch setting illustrated that a significant proportion of sodium may be reduced in hash browns without affecting liking or intake of the food. This study did not find any association between cell taste recognition thresholds, liking, perceived intensity, and sodium intake. Different factors may be involved in reducing any influence cell taste threshold have on liking and intake of salty food. Also, the relationship between liking and saltiness is complex, and the individual variation in oral processing determines the extent to which sodium trapped in the food matrix is released, and is therefore able to contact taste receptors, therefore adds to the complexity in determining the relationship. It has been suggested oral sensitivity studies should be conducted using super-threshold stimuli in food, because threshold testing may not be reliable due to residual sodium chloride left in the mouth after tasting a sodium chloride stimulus. In support of this, the present research did find an association between perceived saltiness intensity ratings and liking for the hash browns. The environment and the context in which the study was performed are likely to have influenced the result. In the current study, there was a positive relationship between saltiness intensity and liking in Study 1 that was conducted in a controlled laboratory setting. However, in Study 2, where the environment was modified to imitate a more natural eating environment, saltiness had no effect on hash browns liking or intake. This could be due to sample size of the hash browns and that the saltiest hash brown is most like when only consuming a small bite. But after half eating to satisfy, any difference in liking between different samples are reduced. Also, it is possible that if we had varied the sodium component of the whole meal, including salad, and measured sodium content of the hash brown, we may have observed increased intake with sodium concentration. Results from this study suggest that intake and liking of hash browns as a part of meal is not significantly affected when the sodium concentration is reduced by 18%. This extends previous research in which 25% sodium reduction were made over a short period of time without influencing consumers' hedonic response. However, in order to accurately assess sodium intake, 24 hours urinary collection and analysis would be required. Some limitations. How do the participants select how much sodium did they intake before the hash brown testing? Did they pass the pre-screening questionnaire? Is there a big enough sample size to reduce the estimate error? Can this participant be generalized to the whole population? These limitations may have affected the power of study to find a difference in liking and consumption. Yet, there was no association between dietary sodium intake, liking of hash browns, and hash brown intake.
Hey, this is Jenny, so let me summarize today's article. Nowadays, many food are made to be salty, and most of people like me really enjoying the salty food. A small amount of sodium is required by the body that plays an essential role to keep the fluid and electrolytes in our body balanced. For both men and women, around 920 to 2,300 mg per day. To say 2,300 mg is equivalent to 1 teaspoon of salt. However, excessive intake in sodium will give rise to a high risk of developing health problems, for example, hypertension, hyperpressure, and other related cardiovascular disease. From the previous part that Emma presented, by reduced sodium intake has been result in decreased liking of salty foods and increased perceived salt intensity over time. If the food became saltier, humans' habituation to higher sodium concentration may have occurred. The study divided into two parts. In Study 1, detection and recognition thresholds for sodium chloride were assessed, and perceived salt intensity and liking for hash browns of varying sodium concentrations 40 mg, 120 mg, 170 mg, and 220 mg sodium per 100 g were conducted in a controlled laboratory environment, while in Study 2, it was switched to a more nature-eating environment, and lunch consisting hash browns, basic salad, and beverage were consumed freely. In both studies, detection and recognition thresholds for concentration in sodium chloride were not associated with perceived saltiness, liking, or intake of hash browns. However, suprathreshold intensity was positively associated with liking, as it increased with sodium chloride concentration. Furthermore, the environment and context in which testing is done can have an influence on the results. The liking of food changes when evaluated as a single item in comparison to a part of a meal, and saltiness is rated as more intense in meals consisting of a number of ingredients rather than a single component. For food industry, when they prepare to meet the possible mandatory restrictions on sodium in foods, the study shows that significant sodium reductions can be achieved without affecting food intake. However, food manufacturers may need to accept slight reductions in consumer preference.